We come in chapter 7 to the first of the two temple sermons, the others found in chapter 26. But chapter 7 begins, I think, the next kind of major unit of the book of Jeremiah. And so I want to read just a few parts of 7 just to set the context for us. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Stand in the gate of the house of the Lord, and there call out this word. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who enter through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Correct your ways and actions, and I will allow you to live in this place. Do not trust deceitful words chanting, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." Instead, if you really correct your ways and your actions, if you act justly toward one another, if you no longer oppress the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, and no longer shed innocent blood in this place or follow other gods, bringing harm on yourselves, I will allow you to live in this place, the land I gave to your ancestors long ago. But look, you keep trusting in deceitful words that cannot help. Do you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods that you have not known? Then do you come and stand before me in this house that bears my name and say, "We are rescued, so we can continue doing all these detestable acts"? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers in your view? Yes, I too have seen it. This is the Lord's declaration. There's no more pointed place for the prophet to speak the word of God than in fact in the temple or in the gate or the doorway of the temple. And that precisely is what we find here, that the prophet has been instructed to go and to speak, because it is truly in the religious experience, the spiritual walk, in the faith formation of these people, that they are either going to live and or die. And he gives them in this passage an overview of the different things that he requires of them. And all of these fall in line with what would typically be understood, or generally so, as living within the covenant framework of righteousness with God and righteousness with other persons. Correct your ways, he says in verse 3. Do not trust in deceitful words. This is the temple of the Lord, this is the temple of the Lord, this is the temple of the Lord. These deceitful words that he references here are likely spoken by false prophets and or others who may have just simply said over and over again that because the temple of the Lord stood in their midst, they would never fall. He will challenge them in a moment when he talks about the example of Shiloh. He says to them again, correct your ways, act justly, no longer oppress. And I just read verse 6, if you'll note the list there. And then there's a remembrance or an echo of what we will find in the New Testament. Has this house become a den of robbers? So this question is set within the larger context of the people's understanding that because the temple was in their midst in Jerusalem, and God's presence was there in the temple, that in fact Jerusalem would never fall because of this. But he tells them in verses 12 through 15 that this is not so, and they should not rely upon this. These are words spoken falsely. These are words that have a little benefit, because when it comes down to it, what really matters is not what goes on externally and ritually, but in the heart that then is reflected in obedience. Verses 12 through 15 spell out this example of Shiloh, and then I'll give you a little more information on the next slide. But return to my place that was at Shiloh, where I made my name dwell there. See what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. Now because you have done all these things, this is the Lord's declaration, and because I have spoken to you time and time again, but you wouldn't listen, and I have called to you, but you wouldn't answer, what I did to Shiloh I will do to the house that bears my name, the house in which you trust, the place I gave you and your ancestors. I will banish you from my presence, just as I banished all your brothers and all the descendants of Ephraim. This is a very important word for us to understand because their reliance upon the ritual and the form of their religion will not serve them when it comes to the relationship of the religion. So we have 2 times in the book of Jeremiah where the temple sermons are portrayed. Jeremiah 7 and also in Jeremiah 26. And in both of these occasions, there's a reference to Shiloh. Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines in about 1050 or so BC. And 1 Samuel 5 recounts the loss of the ark to the Philistines, and it is presumed that Shiloh ceased to exist on really any significant level. But you may remember that the contest between the Israelites and the Philistines was ongoing, and so the battle was to take place in a vicinity very near Shiloh, which is where the Ark of the Covenant resided. It was the custom and the habit of the people to take the ark with them into battle, or potentially they assumed that carrying the ark into battle with them would bring about victory because of the presence of God with them. But they fail to understand that the real heart of the matter, again, was not in the ritual and the form of their faith, but rather in the relationship that truly brought forth the content of their faith. And as a result, when they took out the Ark of the Covenant, they lost the battle to the Philistines. Word came back to Eli, and at that point it says that Eli fell over backwards off of his chair and died. The ark was captured by the Philistines and taken to the Philistine cities, whereby it made a parade from city to city because everywhere that it went, it caused difficulty, some types of tumors and cancers and sickness and disaster. And so they shuffled it one place to the next until finally they decided the only remedy was to actually take the Ark of the Covenant and give it back to the people of Israel, which is exactly what they did. But the point is well made here in these temple sermons, Jeremiah 7 and Jeremiah 26, that the reliance upon the temple, and remember that you have this threefold chant. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. The reliance upon this would never be sufficient when obedience and faithfulness to the covenant is what God truly required of his people. That in fact, they would lose their place. In verses 16 and following of chapter 7, in a powerful, almost symbolic, but in a way that's a little bit of a twist, the prophet is commanded to even not pray over these people, because ultimately the only thing that would ever bring about restoration would in fact be their devastation. It's almost like we say today that until someone hits bottom, they'll never look up for help if they're an alcoholic or a drug addict or addicted to something else. And that's the sense of what I believe the Lord is communicating to Jeremiah here. In other words, we should not at this point spare these people, because it is only in their being conquered that they will eventually return to me. In verses 21 through 26, the Lord asked his people in Exodus to obey and follow him, but they failed to do so. These scriptures, these few short verses, remind the people that the prophets have repeatedly spoken these words. The call and the command is there, but the people have consistently failed. Verses 27 through 34 summarizes that the nation hasn't listened to God and truth has perished. And verse 28 reminds us that the consequences of failure to be obedient and live within that covenant could be extremely dire. That not only will there be devastation, but that without the restraints of living under the framework of a right relationship with God, under the standards of his word, in their case, living within the framework of the covenant, that people would clearly cross the bounds and would even resort to sacrificing and or doing things far beyond what they perhaps could have ever have imagined themselves doing. The place of Topheth in the Ben Hinnom, which is the valley right outside of Jerusalem, was where they sacrificed children. And the prophet tells them that this place will be renamed, that it will now be called the Valley of the Slaughter, where they themselves will be buried, and their corpses will be piled up to be eaten by the animals and the birds of the air. There will be no joy in Jerusalem because of the devastation of the piling up of those who are dead. And this valley of Ben Hinnom, which had been used to sacrifice children because the children of Israel had crossed those boundaries, will now become the very marker of their own faithlessness, their own lack of obedience. Obviously, there are times when we might draw some more commonplace, more, not necessarily commonplace, but more modern analogies. And I think, of course, of the sanctity of human life, which I think is referenced in Jeremiah chapter 1, and how in our generation, in the 20th, now into the 21st century, there has been a significant march of abortion, the sacrificing of the unborn. I think there is a judgment that will come as a result of that as well. Chapter 8 continues the scene from chapter 7. In verses 1 through 3, you see that the bones of the kings, the priests, the prophets, and the residents will be exposed. They'll be desecrated, removed from the graves, and laid out bare. In 4 through 7, the example, they should learn and know their lessons. They should return to the Lord. Even the animals know. The birds of the air know. But my people do not seem to know the requirements of the Lord. In verses 8 through 13, continues to describe the shame, the snare, the destitution. And in verse 12, a very profound statement, and when I punish them, they will collapse. I think it's perhaps indicative that while there certainly are historically nations that have fallen from without, from foreign nations, from the encroaching of other countries upon them, the most devastating also occurs when a nation falls from within. And the nation of Israel has fallen from within long before they fell from without. And I think there's a lesson there that we should also understand about who we are as a nation and how we should live, that we stand strong internally and spiritually, though the indications of our current culture and society do not seem to correspond to that. Verse 13, what I have given them will be lost to them. Whereas before I had provided productivity, produce, prosperity, well-being, what I had given will be lost. Verses 14 through 17 seem to be voiced from a different point of view, but the result is the same. No healing. There will only be terror that the people will experience. In Jeremiah 8, verses 18 through 9:3, we come to the second of the laments. These confessions of the prophet, these laments, these anguished outcries truly indicate how Jeremiah saw what the people were doing and how it grieved him. Once again, the prophet and Yahweh indicated that his heart was sick. He's broken by the brokenness of his people. He said, I would weep day and night. These things indicate that the prophet feels deeply, as well as God, Yahweh, grieves over his people. Verses 4 through 16 describes the imminent fall. I will make Jerusalem a heap of rubble. I will scatter them among the nations. I will send a sword after them until I have finished them off, as indicated in verse 16. Clearly, the Lord has spoken over and over again about what will happen to his people. 17 through 22, there's a mourning and a dirge, for death has climbed through our windows. That's a powerful image. Death has climbed through our windows, as though the robber and the burglar, the conqueror, has at nighttime entered the very home to pillage, a home to devastate. Death has climbed through our windows. Verses 23 through 25, the day is coming for all nations for judgment who are uncircumcised. But like Judah has an uncircumcised heart. And as the people of God perhaps are judged first because of them being the people of God. Chapter 10, the nature and disgrace of idolatry. We come in chapter 10 and then in chapter 11 to two very, I think, standalone chapters. Chapter 10 talks significantly about the nature of idolatry, the foolishness of pursuing idolatry, the foolishness of those who make idols and worship them, the foolishness of thinking that those idols have power compared to God himself. And it is, in fact, stupidity and ignorance, as found in verse 14, that anyone would engage in idolatry. Verses 1 through 5 talks about the way of the nations and the falsity of these idols. In other words, the making of the idols, they cannot speak, they cannot walk, they cannot predict, they cannot do anything. This is what foreign nations do, but this is not what Israel is supposed to do. In fact, Israel, when comparing idolatry with God, should easily choose God himself. Verses 6 through 10, the comparison with the true God. Other nations are foolish, instructed by idols, where there is only one true God. Do you not see it? Do you not understand it? Verses 11 through 13, a comparison that our God Creator is greater than the created. Think of the idols being objects that were created, and is contrasted then with God, who is the creator of all. So if we as humans create idols, why would we worship them? When in fact we can create, when we can worship the creator of all. They did not make the heavens, the idols that is, only God did. He causes creation, the clouds, the rain, and all that is incumbent or is obvious in what we know of and see as our existence in creation. Idols did not do that, only God. Verses 14 through 16. There's foolishness, stupidity, and ignorance in the images that are made. Why would we then trust those things? Continuing in chapter 10, verses 17 through 18. Once again, gather and prepare for the siege. 19 through 22 is a woe oracle, one of a number that you will see scattered throughout the prophets in particular. These cities will be made desolate. In 23 through 25, we have a prayer of Jeremiah, a plea that as God speaks and disciplines himself, that he would do so with justice and not anger, but likewise a request for God to deal with the nations who do not call on him, in part because they have made Judah desolate. Chapter 11 gives us another kind of a cohesive unit here. So 10 is a little bit of a standalone. Chapter 11 is also something of a standalone in that it deals specifically with the covenant. Remember that the concept of covenant is a thread that we're going to see over and over again throughout the book of Jeremiah. Verses 1 through 8 are a reminder of the covenant terms. If the people obey God, God will be with them. You shall be my people and I will be your God. So this correlates to the earlier promise in which God has said, even in Deuteronomy, that this is the way this can work. The concept of obedience is clear. Verses 3, 4, 6, and 7 all indicate that obedience is a part of this covenant agreement, and that in reality, if people will simply obey and be faithful, then God, who is omnipresent and omniscient and omnipotent, omnipowerful, will be with them and will protect them. But the results of disobedience are the curses of the covenant. And in 9 through 17, because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant, he in fact will bring disaster. Verses 18 through 21, this shifts just a little bit because it gives us some information about Jeremiah himself and some of the predicament that he's in. Jeremiah is not appreciated for the things that he has said and the things that he is doing. This will persist in large part throughout all of his ministry. You may remember in the latter part of his life, he was actually thrown into a pit and placed there at the king's bequest. And here we see in 18 through 21, a little bit of a glimpse of a plot against Jeremiah. The Lord informed Jeremiah himself about what was developing and how this was to take place. In 18 through 20, we see the speech of Jeremiah in regards. And then in 21 through 23, we see the Lord's judgment upon the persons in Anatoth, very likely the very ones who had intended to take Jeremiah's life. So chapter 11 is really kind of an interesting interlude. And then we come to chapter 12 to conclude this section for us today. We're almost 20 minutes in. In verses 1 through 4, we have Jeremiah's complaint against the Lord. Let me read the first part of this so that you can see just a little bit about the dynamic here. You will be righteous, Lord, even if I bring a case against you. Yet I wish to contend with you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the treacherous live in ease? And then continuing on in verse 4, how long will the land mourn and the grass of every field wither because of the evil of his residents? Animals and birds have been swept away. The people have said, he cannot see what our end will be. So Jeremiah is complaining to the Lord, and this is perhaps just a reflection of our own human nature about what we see happening in our lives when we do not understand it, or when unexpected things happen, or things happen out of the order and time in which we would wish. So Jeremiah's complaint is clear. Lord, you're righteous. Even if I bring a case against you, you're going to be righteous. But here's my case. Why do the wicked prosper? Why do the treacherous live at ease? How long will it linger before judgment actually comes? So in other words, Jeremiah is saying, I'm looking around, Lord. I've been prophesying. I've told people that the end is coming. The Lord is, that we've heard recently that the people said they don't see it. They don't know how the end is going to happen. They don't understand it, and they're saying maybe even that God doesn't know it. Jeremiah doesn't know it, whatever it might be. How long is this going to take place before you do finally come through and do what I've been prophesying all about? So the Lord's response in verses 5 and 6, and some do see 7 through 13 as a part of his response, the longer response. But the Lord reminds Jeremiah of the need for perseverance. In other words, if you want to run races, then you need to be prepared to run the full race. If you want to preach this word, then you need to be prepared to hang in there until the very end, when it will take place. So the Lord reminds Jeremiah of the need for perseverance. And the Lord further reveals that some of the very people that Jeremiah may be close to in his own hometown may be the very ones who will plot against him. But the Lord will take care of this. In 7 through 13, the Lord indicates he has left his people to their own consequences. Judgment, in fact, will come, and the Lord will bring judgment upon those who beset his people, whether that's Jeremiah himself or ultimately the nations who then make their way against Judah will eventually one day pay for their own unrighteousness as well. Well, we're about 23 minutes in. I think this is a good place to stop. We've gone from chapters 7 through 12. Good overview of what kind of serves as a second major unit of the book of Jeremiah. And there again are so many ways that all of this can be structured, and it is difficult to structure with some consistency because of the wide variety of types of oracles and narrative prose, and then the juxtaposition from a historical and chronological point of view. But we'll end with chapter 12 here. We'll pick up in the next video, probably next week, with 13 and following. So we'll see you then. Hope you've enjoyed it thus far.